Sports for Real again with Coach Hall. Today, they're finally going to play the FCS championship football game. You got a rematch from conference rivals North Dakota State, South Dakota State. North Dakota State, we know all about them. Today, they're going for their 10th championship in FCS since 2011. South Dakota State, they won the conference by beating North Dakota State 23-21. So today we're going to get the rematch. The first game, like I say, was won 23-21, but oftentimes when you have the rematches, it favors the team who lost the first game. So in all likelihood, you're probably going to see North Dakota State hoist the trophy for the 10th time in the past 12 years. But I want to segue a little bit about that. Earlier I had told you that the NCAA really didn't want HBCUs in the college football playoffs, and I got a little bit more proof to back my theory up. Well, they say that A&M, they couldn't get into the playoffs because the conference schedule and the opponents that they played weren't up to par for playoff standards. Well, A&M lost 2 games. They started out by losing to North Carolina, a Division I team in the ACC. They played a respectable ball game, but they lost as expected. Then they came the next week, went down to Miami and lost to Jackson State. We know the story with them. Well, they ran off 9 straight victories after that, and they ended up with only 2 losses for the year. But the NCAA said they weren't worthy of the playoffs. But let's see who were worthy of the playoffs. Well, if you look at conference schedules and the teams that got into the playoffs, the Big Sky Conference, they got 5 teams in, and the CAA got 5 teams in. There are several conferences with 2 entrances, but none from an HBCU. And they even have a team in here, Eastern Kentucky, who lost 4 games. Now, in Eastern Kentucky's defense, they did play 2 teams who got into the playoffs. They ended up losing to Gardner-Webb, and they also beat Southeast Missouri early in the year. But if you got 5 teams from one conference and 5 teams from another conference, that's 10 teams out of 24. How is it that this conference is so much greater than anybody else? Why don't you just have your own separate championship? If these 2 conferences are so strong, why don't you just have those 2 battle it out and call it that, instead of putting on this charade saying that, this is a national tournament. There's no reason why A&M shouldn't have been in the playoffs, especially when you see Eastern Kentucky with a 7-4 record. Now, these records that I'm speaking of, they're the final records. So that 4th loss that they had was the Gardner-Webb, eliminated them in the first round. But still, you got a whole lot of teams in here with a whole lot of losses, and they all seem to be from the same conferences. If you're going to have a national tournament, you need to invite a national participant base. So there's no way in the world you can justify, even if the Southwest Athletic Conference was as weak as they're making it out to be, the champion or representative of that conference needs to be there to validate whatever point you're trying to make. But when you have 5 teams from one conference and 5 from another, and then have a team that sneak in with 4 losses, then what are you really saying? Why don't you just call it what it is? I don't want an HBCU in the playoffs. That's the only way you can justify what we're seeing here. But like I said before, you got 2 worthy opponents playing for the national championship today, and I don't really care for the fact that they are from the same conferences. But when you have a bracket and you send one team in one direction and the other in the other direction, and they win their way back to each other, I don't care if they lived on the same block. They're worthy to play for a national championship. The problem I have, when you handpick 2 teams and say, well, this is the best teams in the nation because they had such a great game, a la LSU and Alabama about 10 years ago. That'd be fine if you have a playoff and they play their way back to each other. But to choose them and say they're the best, that's not logical at all. But a case like today, North Dakota State, South Dakota State, very, very, very good matchup. And looking at that matchup, I watched both those teams play in the playoffs. North Dakota State surviving off pretty much reputation. They're not as good as they've been, but they're still dangerous. South Dakota State, very good football team, but the layoff, I think, favors North Dakota State. So having said that, I expect North Dakota State to hoist that trophy for the 10th time in the last 12 years. Sports for real.